Okay, shalom, good evening. We feel privileged to open the evening, which we captioned Extinguishing a Crisis or Looking the Other Way. My name is Gilead Sher. I'm heading the Center for Applied Negotiations in this institute. And the main theme of the next couple of hours here with you is the P5+1 negotiation process with Iran on the JCPOA. A week ago, in a set of remarks made in Washington, former Secretary Kerry issued an alarming statement, recapped by Associated Press and the Times of Israel. Kerry said he doesn't know whether Iran will resume pursuing a nuclear weapon in 10 or 15 years after restrictions in the deal sunset. A second comment, which I would like to draw your attention to, was made a few days later, just a couple of days ago, by former Mossad head, Efraim Halevi. He spoke on I-24 News, and he expressed support to Israel's opening a dialogue, direct dialogue, with Tehran. I guess that both these statements will be discussed later on, and I hope that some of the insights that would be drawn from this conference will be valid for the way forward, as well as within the North Korean context. Now, we are honored to have with us today Mr. Jay Solomon. He is one of the top American journalists covering international affairs for more than 2 decades. He's written from Asia, Africa, and the Middle East for the Wall Street Journal. The paper nominated him for 3 Pulitzer Prizes. He's currently the Siegel Distinguished Visiting Scholar at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. So without further ado, Jay, the stage is yours.
Good evening, good afternoon. Great to be here. I'd like to thank Emily and Amos and Gilead for bringing me here. I feel okay. It was a long flight, so I hope I haven't brought a cold from Washington. But, last year I wrote a book on Iran called The Iran Wars, which it was about the 10-year conflict, basically, since 9/11 between the United States and Iran, starting with the invasion of Iraq and how the Iranians really used the invasion to bleed the United States, but to also kind of use the power vacuum to spread its power into Iraq and further into the region. And the book concludes with the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement of 2015. But in the years since the book's come out, obviously a lot has happened, and I've been able to reflect a bit more on what happened. And I think I wanted to start my talk tonight about where I think Iran was when the negotiations started to take place in 2012 and where they went in 2013. Because I think if you really look at it from the Iranian perspective, you can see that from what they were facing and the threats they were facing, they made out from this agreement very well. I think in my research and trips to Iran in the years before the negotiations, I really got the perception that the sanctions, the financial warfare on them was devastating in ways that I don't think most people really realize. When I went there in 2014, I can remember meeting the deputy governor of the central bank, and they were basically in a panic. They did not know how to get dollars. Their system, I don't know if they were having sort of an economic shock per se, but they were definitely having a financial shock, and you got the sense that they knew they needed to get the sanctions lifted, and the financial pressure was not sustainable. And I know when President Rouhani took office, he made presentations to the supreme leader basically saying the financial crisis is going to become a threat to the regime, it's going to become a threat to the revolution. So I think from the Iranian perspective, getting the sanctions lifted were probably the first biggest threat. I think they were worried in 2012, 2010, 2012 about the potential for an Israeli strike, and that was weighing on the Iranian mindset. I think they figured they wanted to maintain their nuclear and ballistic missile infrastructure in the long term, and while they knew they needed to negotiate, they wanted to basically come up with a way that will allow them to maintain that infrastructure, even if they have to, give some ground in the short term. I think, and this is probably not weighed enough in analyzing the JCPOA and the events, I think in 2012 they were very concerned about the collapse of the Assad regime. I think they saw, the combination of the financial pressure, the military threat, and the potential overthrow of their biggest Arab ally, the country that gives them strategic depth, and their ability to project into Lebanon, into the Palestinian territories. They were weighing, the cost of losing Assad with these other threats to their system, and I think they felt negotiations were another way to sort of draw on the West and give them potentially diplomatic cover to continue what they were doing in Syria. And I think really if you look at it, basically those four lines, the financial sanctions, saving their allies in the region, maintaining their ballistic missile and nuclear infrastructure, and warding off an Israeli attack. I think entering into the negotiation were brilliant. They basically achieved all of those aims in over 2 years and went from a position of a lot of weakness to a particular position of strength now. And the question I wrestle with in the book, and which I still wrestle with, is how are they able to, achieve that when the deck seemed to be stacked against them so much? And I basically came up with around five scenarios of why the negotiations kind of played out the way they did. I think one, the Obama administration, rightly or wrongly, convinced themselves, maybe spooked themselves, that Israel was going to launch strikes. I think they particularly thought this in 2012 when there were some military exercises taking place in Israel. The relationship between President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu was not very strong. And I think that's why you saw this kind of push by the Obama administration to start some sort of diplomatic engagement, which did start in the first direct talks between the United States and Iran that took place in Oman in 2012. And nothing really happened. The talks were largely described as a failure, but they did kind of start the process. And even though the Israelis weren't consulted, I think the word was getting around, and the diplomatic cover kind of might be used to ward off an Israeli attack. So I think that was one thing that was going through the mind of the Obama administration when the diplomatic process started. I also think there was a massive shift in the personnel from the first Obama administration into the second, where you went from Hillary Clinton, who was, I think, pretty hawkish on Iran, to Secretary Kerry, who really has made this kind of career of reaching out, whether it was to the Assad regime when he was in the Senate, or Javad Zarif in Iran, I think he has it in his DNA that he can negotiate with these types of regimes. And I think the people in the White House, you saw a real shift from kind of more traditional mainstream foreign policy people like the National Security Council, Tom Donilon, to Dennis Ross was the Middle East advisor. Second term, you've got Rob Malley, another guy like Kerry who's very invested in reaching out to the Syrians, the Iranians, Hamas, some of these groups. So I think the DNA of the personnel involved shifted, and that had a huge impact on the negotiations as well. And I personally don't think the U.S. negotiating strategy initially was envisioned to be dominated so much by Kerry. I think, President Obama had Bill Burns and other kind of really seasoned diplomats doing a lot of the negotiations initially, but as the process played out, Kerry really personalized it in a lot of ways, for better or for worse. But I think that did have a big impact on the talks. And I think President Obama really did see the Iran agreement as his key foreign policy legacy, and the politics and the timing of it were kind of moving in real term in a way that I think the Iranians understood would play into their advantage. They knew there was a ticking clock, that Obama had to get this deal done in the last 12 to 18 months of his tenure, or the time would pass, and they were able to use that to their advantage. And I also think, particularly in retrospect, I think the Iranians and the Russians were working somehow behind the scenes in ways, particularly in Syria, as the nuclear talks were going on, that kind of allowed them to play or manipulate the United States and the European countries in ways that we only kind of noticed later on. Looking with these factors that were going on at the time, I think there are a few kind of flashpoints that I noticed where, if you look back, the U.S. made concessions, or there were developments that kind of encapsulate what I was talking about. One of the more interesting kind of anecdotes I remember is that, the real key issue initially for the negotiations was Iran going to be allowed to enrich uranium? That was kind of the red line at first, because the U.S. position was this country should not be allowed to produce nuclear fuel on its soil. Once you can enrich uranium, once you can reprocess spent plutonium, you inevitably have the military option. And that was kind of the red line, and the U.S. did not want to give that red line away. And one of the more dysfunctional elements is when you had almost a two-track negotiation going on, at least at the beginning of the negotiations. You had John Kerry, when he was still in the Senate, as the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, was communicating to the Iranians through the Omanis in 2012. And in my reporting for the book, he was communicating quite clearly to the Omanis that, we recognize, through the Omanis, we recognize that, you guys will have the right to enrich uranium. And that was kind of giving away what was the biggest sticking point from the front end. But then you had Secretary Clinton was still in power, and one of her envoys and a White House envoy were showing up. This is kind of March 2013, after the re-election of President Obama. The Iranians were already saying, look, you've already given that up. You've already given us the right to enrich. And that was not the position of where the Obama administration wanted to be. I think they would have probably gone in that direction, but that kind of showed you, I think, from the Iranian perspective, they could feel Kerry was coming in there, that they've got this huge win at the front end. They didn't even have to negotiate. They just had to show up, and they had already run the enrichment battle. And I think that, to me, was really a key moment, and was not known at the time that Kerry was playing this kind of back-channel role. Another part, I think, in the negotiations, you could feel in a lot of ways the Iranians kind of knew us better than we knew them. They had studied us. And one of the interesting parts of the talk was when the Iranians brought the head of the Atomic Energy Commission, Ali Akbar Salehi, into the diplomatic process. He really is seen as kind of the brains behind the program. And we then brought in our Secretary of Energy, Ernie Moniz, and I think Salehi, more than anyone, understood what they wanted. And he really made a sticking point of demanding that they get to keep these advanced centrifuges. And I don't think the Americans really, I don't think Moniz even understood that, the Iranians wanted to get rid of their older centrifuges. So they were kind of seeing this as an opportunity. While on the one hand it looked like they were giving something up, which they did. They gave up these first-generation centrifuges that were getting old. But under the final agreement, they got to keep developing these other centrifuges on the side. So when the limits on the program lift in 10 years, they might have already mastered these second, third generation centrifuges. So in a lot of ways, it won't look like they gave up that much. They'll be able to, rapidly produce the fuel that they gave up in a very short time.
But you said something that the American side didn't understand?
I don't think they understood as well as, they brought in the head of the Atomic Energy Commission. I think they had, a really pre-thought out plan of what we want at the end. I think the Americans were very reactive They were just trying to get a deal rather than thinking out more what they wanted at the end. The other kind of flashpoints that I saw was the PMD, the possible military dimensions, was a huge issue going back a while because the U.S. had intelligence that the Iranians were doing secretive nuclear weapons development at a place called Parchin, and that was an absolute red line. And as the process kind of moved towards the end, this is where you could really feel kind of the desperation on the U.S. side that they had to get the deal done, that they created this almost kabuki dance where the deal was signed in the end, and the IAEA then went into Parchin after the agreement was signed, and we found out later they actually did find man-made uranium particles at the site, but at that point everyone was so invested in the agreement, the whole issue of something that I think would have been raised as a smoking gun maybe 4 or 5 years earlier, even 2 years earlier, the whole issue kind of got buried. And I think this is what, when you talk about the sustainability of the nuclear agreement in the long term, the fact that uranium was found there, no kind of protest was made at the time. You're either going to have a situation in a few years' time where we basically accept it, or there's going to be a crisis regardless of what Donald Trump decides to do. A couple other areas where I thought there was kind of a rush at the end in very kind of in-your-face ways. That the sanctions were placed on all of the IRGC commanders and military folks, and as the agreement, in the last kind of few days of the agreement, as the clock was running down, the Iranians brought these huge lists of people they wanted removed from the sanctions list. And I don't think most of them were vetted almost in any way about which guys were on it. I remember one of the names, as we were kind of sanitizing or going through all of these names on these hundreds of pages, dozens of pages of lists, was Qasem Soleimani, the head of the IRGC, the Quds Force. And we started to ask, like, how could you agree to the Europeans, the UN lifting sanctions on Soleimani? And the initial reaction was, well, I can remember Wendy Sherman told us that there are a lot of guys in Iran named Qasem Soleimani, which was a little, I got to the point I didn't know if they didn't know that they had just let this guy or agreed to let him off, or it was obfuscating what would happen. But it kind of was an example of this kind of push to getting a deal done. And then the final kind of area where I think you could feel this kind of, there's another red line collapsing was on the missiles. Because the missile, that was not part of, and a year before they'd say, the missiles are a red line, we're going to deal with them. Kerry repeatedly said, the missile program, we'll deal with it. And it was another issue that kind of came up at the last minute. And you just got the sense that the U.S. wanted the agreement, this kind of short-term watering down of the UN Security Council was agreed to, and now we've got the situation now where you're not really sure what the international position is. The Security Council doesn't kind of really formally forbid ballistic missile tests, but the U.S. says it does, and there's a lot of uncertainty. And I also think one of the most striking parts of the Vienna talks was that there was this hope, certainly Kerry was promoting it, the UN, the EU Foreign Policy Chief Mogherini, that if, God, we could just get the nuclear agreement with the Iranians, we're going to be able to cooperate with them on Syria, and we'll use the same process for Iran that we'll use to settle the Syrian war. And we didn't know it at the time, but kind of exactly as all these negotiations in Vienna are going on, Qasem Soleimani is traveling to Russia. Some of the supreme leader's closest advisors are traveling to Russia, and they're basically gaming out a situation where they're going to jointly go into military operations into Syria just weeks after the nuclear agreement was signed. And I think, in retrospect, that was probably gamed out by the Russians and the Iranians. They'd use kind of the euphoria or the cover of the nuclear agreement to double down in Syria, and they've done that, extremely successfully. I guess now looking forward, now that the agreement is now in its second year. I think one of the things that have really struck me is how it's been used by the Iranians almost to handcuff the West. And you can really feel it because there's a huge negotiation now in the United States and the Europeans about, there were problems in the nuclear agreement, the missile program, how do we push back against what they're doing in Syria, in Yemen, and Lebanon. But in these deliberations, you constantly hear it that, we can't go back to the type of sanctions that we used so effectively in 2012 or 2013 because that would be a violation of the nuclear agreement. And I think the Iranians kind of knew that they'd create this situation of nuclear blackmail. If you get them into this agreement, anytime they discuss pressuring us, we will threaten to walk out, or the Europeans will say it could break it down. And I think anyone who knows how much pressure the sanctions brought, you're only really going to get there if you go after their oil, or if you go after the central bank of Iran, or the real nodes, the state banks that were hit so hard. But anytime this is raised now, the Iranians will say that's a violation of the agreement. And I think they're successfully doing that. I mean, the types of sanctions the Trump administration have been putting in place they're not going to have any real impact. They're just kind of tactical moves. So to get back to the type of pressure that would be needed on the financial front, I think if you go in that direction, the deal would inevitably collapse. I don't know how it would. And I also think the Iranians have used the JCPOA incredibly effectively as a diplomatic cover for what they've done in Syria. It's amazing when you think of the atrocities that have taken place in Syria in the last 4 or 5 years, the use of chemical weapons. The Iranians you almost never hear their name in the debate of the atrocities committed by the Assad regime. And I do think a big reason of that is the West, the U.S. invested so heavily in this JCPOA. If you start raising, the idea of Iranian generals being tried in The Hague for war crimes, which I think most people would think they should be, it just doesn't happen. Most of the pressure is focused on the Russians or the Syrians themselves, and not the Iranians, despite the incredible role they played. And I think the JCPOA has really provided them with that diplomatic cover. And I also think in the last 6 or 7 months, why the Obama administration approached Iran the way they did, I think there's a lot of debate. Some of it, it was political, he wanted a legacy, but I also really think there's a lot more evidence now that the Obama team really believed that they could develop Iran as a partner, that they could provide strategic balance. And I've noticed, particularly in the last few months, where you see the Saudis, Mohammed bin Salman, talking about these reforms, you hear a lot of criticism of the Saudi position from a lot of the Obama crowd, and I think that is reflective of their belief that the Saudis, the big Sunni states, these were the bigger problems. Iran could counterbalance them, and I think they were investing in that. And whether that was the right move or not, they didn't really enunciate that at the time. But they thought they kind of, in some ways, wanted to empower Iran against these Sunni states. But I think that's become a lot more clear, actually, since they've left office and they've spoken a lot more clearly. Now it gets us to where can President Trump go? And I think he has spoken quite aggressively against Iran. It might be the one policy he's talked the most about, but it's a real conflicted picture, because I'm personally pretty skeptical seeing what they've done in Syria. They're not suggesting any major effort there to push back against the Iranians. It looks in a lot of ways, with ISIS falling, that the U.S. might pull back, and the Iranians and the Assad regime and these militias are going to fill that vacuum. And we'll see what happens with the JCPOA, but I'm not seeing at this stage the will to have the type of financial pressure that would be needed, I think, to really push back the Iranians, irrespective of the military front. So I think the Obama legacy, the nuclear deal, might kind of live on a lot of ways in its current form, unless there's some move to find some common ground between the Europeans and the United States that, there's got to be a more concerted effort to push back. I will stop there, and thank you very much. Sure.
Yeah, hi. Quick question for you, actually going back to what you said towards the end about how to go forward in the role of the Europeans. One thing I understood from the fix-it-or-nix-it approach and the policy that Donald Trump wanted to do, or wants to do still through the Congress, is basically for the U.S. to set new terms on its own that Iran would have to abide by, or else the United States would impose its own sanctions or secondary sanctions and somehow put pressure on Iran. On the other hand, Prime Minister Netanyahu, in his speech this morning, actually, at the Jerusalem Post conference, and I think also in his Saban speech, told the audience, get European governments to get on board with the U.S. policy. So it sort of contradicts the idea that the United States on its own can impose changes in the deal. I mean, what do you think the answer is? Does the U.S. and / Israel have to convince the Europeans to change their mind, strong-arm the Europeans to change their mind, or can the United States on its own basically just pass secondary sanctions and impose a new deal? Fix it unilaterally.
No, I think it's got to be kind of a combination. I mean, if you look at the sanctions, people forget that Europeans were not excited about the types of sanctions that were put in place starting in 2006. I mean, they were, the French, the Germans were all heavily invested there then. And, the reason they were ultimately successful, I think, was a combination of both. I think you had European banks getting fined, I think, at least $10 billion by the U.S. for breaking Iran sanctions. So they panicked. So in that sense, it was a unilateral move. I do think Obama's kind of willingness to, I think he did play a adept hand at playing, we want to negotiate with these guys. So they kind of shifted they didn't look recalcitrant, so it was hard for the Europeans to say, you're not trying to at least negotiate with these guys. So, it's hard with Trump because I knowing how long it took to get the types of sanctions that actually worked through, it took, probably 5, 6, 7 years. It's kind of hard to see in this environment with the bitterness between the Europeans and the U.S. at this stage for them to kind of bring them in through the diplomatic process. It just doesn't seem like there's not the staffing. So we could try to strong-arm them, and that would probably work to some degree because ultimately any bank knows that they need access to dollars much more than they need the real. But the diplomacy of it, it's interesting. We were talking earlier, you do see the French and the Brits to some extent starting to move a bit because they've gotten a bit freaked out by Trump's language. Mogherini, on the other hand, is playing, the EU foreign policy chief is very kind of steadfast. We struck this deal, and that's just the way it is. So, I think that the financial hammer is always there because the dollar is preeminent, but I think you'd have to see from the Trump administration more concerted diplomacy to see it really working in any cohesive way, and I just don't see that yet.
Thank you. Going forward as well, I'm looking back at the summer, and when the Iran-North Korea, countering Iran, North Korea, and Russia new Sanctions Act was passed, there were quite a lot of media reports talking about the involvement of the Obama administration staffers in helping the Trump administration formulate the legislation. Adam Zubin was quoted as looking into making sure it wouldn't violate the JCPOA. The work being done now in DC, looking at the decertification and looking to January and the 4 waivers that need to be renewed, do you see, because you mentioned there are no staffs, no staffers in state and to a certain degree in Treasury, but I think that's a different situation. But what do you see the involvement of the Obama team even now in formulating the Trump administration's policy?
I mean, the Treasury developed, the U.S. Treasury Department developed incredible knowledge since 9/11 on how to execute financial warfare, both from the Bush and the Obama administration. And there were a lot of holdovers. Tragically, I think most of those people are gone now. I mean, you don't have many of the people who really ramped up the financial war on Iran or North Korea still around, although I do think the lessons learned. But I think the hope was that you'd get bipartisan legislation in the Congress. Senator Cardin and Senator Corker are kind of leading that charge.
Do you see them leading that?
No. I mean, the problem is that things are so poisoned now. Like Trump and Corker can't even be in the same room with each other. So I don't think that legislation's really gone anywhere. So that's kind of that's what we don't know where things are headed, because Trump has basically said, if I don't get legislation that I want, that others are going to play ball with, I'm just going to pull out. And he could do that, but then there's still the question of what exactly is going to be the strategy besides just pulling back. But I don't think the legislation and the kind of coordination between the Treasury and the people in Congress who know about the sanctions has really happened in an effective way. Yeah.
I want to challenge the notion that somehow the Biden administration pushed the idea that through the GCPOA there'd be more cooperation with Iran. I think consistently I heard the opposite, that they were under no illusions this wasn't going to work, would help in other areas. This was just an isolated thing, just to stop Iran getting nuclear weapons.
That was the public stance. But I can say in private, I know, John Kerry thought he was going to fly to Tehran. They thought this was going to be the open, because the deal in a lot of sense wouldn't make sense if you didn't think there was going to be political change. I mean, they definitely had this belief that we'll kind of bring them into the system, they'll be more engaged in the economic system of the world, the pace will moderate gradually over time, and there was definitely talk in Vienna in 2015 that the nuclear deal would kind of breed cooperation, particularly in Syria, and they immediately moved to try to bring the Iranians into the diplomatic process on the Syria front with the Russians, but they were playing a totally different game. They were showing up at these meetings and then double or triple downing what they were doing militarily in Syria. So I know what you're saying. They've said this was not a political agreement. This was purely a non-proliferation agreement. But I fully believe that they thought this was going to bring political change into Iran. Yeah.
You said that America, or you insinuated that America made a mistake of allowing Iran to have enrichment up front. Just want to ask you a question. How many Iran experts, not proliferation experts, not security experts, but Iran experts who speak Persian, who study politics of Iran, have you met in your life, one or two or three, who told you that there can be any deal with Iran without allowing Iran to retain some kind of enrichment on its soil? How many? One, two...
Well, the Iranians I met all said they would never come to a deal. The foreign minister, the deputy foreign minister.
Did you have any Iran expert who told you that it is possible to reach a deal with Iran without allowing them to have any enrichment?
I don't think no enrichment was ever. But I think it was.
So it's a smart move that you allowed it up front. I don't know why people are criticizing it, because everybody who studied that regime can tell you asking the Iranian regime to give up enrichment is like asking Hamas to give up every single Kalashnikov that it has in its arsenal. It's nice, but it's not going to happen. So I think the criticism is not very realistic.
Do you think they should have just given it up front?
Everybody would have liked that, but this regime's...
I think my biggest criticism, and what I was saying was the negotiating position too was not kind of. I know the White House was still saying we might have to give it up, but let's breed it into the process. While Kerry was saying, of course you can have it. So I think the criticism I was talking about was the right and the left hand from the U.S. side wasn't necessarily working at the same front, because I think you're right. I think Hillary Clinton was probably the most hawkish, grudgingly in her last months in office, said, okay, we'll probably have to give them something, but let's not give it up at the beginning. Let's make it as limited as possible. But Kerry was saying, yeah, of course you can have some. And that caused, probably tactical problems on the negotiating side. Yeah.
When we say fixing the deal, is this policy designed to stop Iran from reaching a nuclear military arsenal, which I think the GCPOA is already doing that, according to Vienna as well? Or is it's designed to alter Iran's regional role? And when we say altering Iran's regional role, is there anyone, not in the region, in the world, have like specific policy? How can we stop Iran from being the hegemonic power in Lebanon, in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, in the rest of the region? Because I don't think that there's anyone in the world has really a clear vision. How can we stop this? It's like everyone is saying, let's stop Iran from being that powerful in the region, but no one has said anything fruitful about how can we do this. So do you think this fixing the deal approach could do any good to when it comes to this end game? What is the end game?
Yeah, I think for me the hardest part was that the Obama administration thought, as someone was saying, you can keep the nuclear issue will just be here and everything else will go here, and they're not interrelated. And I found it was really hard, like the sanctions. When you talk to people in the Treasury Department, they saw the sanctions as a way to box Iran in financially. They're doing all these nefarious things, so we want to deny them the funding to do that. But then as the negotiations gathered pace, it removed, no, the sanctions were just put in place to get them to the negotiating table. And I don't think that was originally it depends who you talk to, but I think the Treasury people saw that, no, sanctions are a way to prevent them from doing all sorts of things, and then that was suddenly pulled back. So, I think it's hard to sort of disassociate one from the other because I think they're interlinked. But no, I think you're right on how to push them back. I don't think the United States itself at this time is committed to take the type of steps to, like you've got all these irregular, asymmetrical forces in these countries, and we're not going to put American troops on the ground, and you have Saudi, Emirati, allies who don't seem nearly as adept at this type of warfare as the Iranians will, and until there's, some strategy on that front to kind of marry with an attempt to stop the nuclear program in 10 years, we've got a problem. Great.
Thank you, Jay.